Welcome to the Online Great Books podcast, brought to you by OnlineGreatBooks.com, where we talk about the good life, the great books, great conversation, and great ideas. I'm Scott Hambrick.
I'm Karl Shute.
And today we're going to talk about our dead friend, our recently deceased friend, Harold Bloom. I never met the man, but I consider him a friend. He's an ally. He died last week, and we needed to talk about him anyway. We should have talked about him earlier. We're a little late to the party.
I remember when the book came out, I might have poked through it a little bit in the bookstore, but I don't have a great deal of familiarity with Harold Bloom, but he was always out there as a defender of canonicity and of reading good things.
The book that you reference is The Western Canon.
Yes.
The Book and School of the Ages by one Harold Bloom.
Yeah, Scott and I read the first chapter and thought we would talk about it, and I have a million things underlined.
It's polemical.
If you're easily offended, you might get offended, and that means you probably ought to read it if you're easily offended. Because if you're easily offended, you probably should be offended.
Right. Mr. Bloom, Dr. Bloom, was a professor of humanities at Yale. I think he went to Harvard, and he fancied himself a literary critic, which I think is interesting, and was a big proponent of the Western Canon. And he wrote this book in 1994, The Western Canon. And in the back of the thing, he has several appendices where he puts forth what he thinks the canon should be. And at one point in the book, he says that his list is about 3,000 titles. It is extensive. His canon is a whole lot bigger than the sort of Adlerian, the Mortimer Adler style canon. But he makes arguments in chapter 1 of the Western Canon. The chapter is titled An Elegy for the Canon. He makes arguments for why the thing is important and why the opponents or those who would open the canon have got it all wrong.
Right. So the thing that I thought that made my antennae perk up, because it's a little bit different, I think, than the way we think of it.
It is.
At Online Great Books, is it's actually in the preface, aesthetic value, that books are great. And they just are, and this has nothing to do or little to do with any theological or philosophical or social benefit that they bring you.
Yes, or I think he thinks that their aesthetic beauty maybe is the social value they bring to society.
Well, so the enemies, let's talk about who the enemies are of the canon. And I encountered this a little bit in my own academic career as the last remnants of the liberal arts were emasculated over my 20 years or so in the academy. It was always to be more relevant. There was always a goal that the people destroying the canon had in mind, which was generally some kind of political goal, something of the age. We needed to get with modern times. We needed to read stuff that basically reinforced everything we already thought. And so you get rid of Shakespeare, you get rid of Virgil, you get rid of Homer, and you replace it with more modern stuff. I don't know, Maya Angelou, for example.
Yeah, he actually names Angelou, Alice Walker, Foucault, and others in here.
Yeah, who are just not, they're just not that good.
Yeah.
In my opinion, I'm with him on that. If you don't remember, dear listener, back in whenever Clinton was elected.
Oh God, I remember.
Maya Angelou came up and read a poem, and it's not a good poem. I went back and reread it because Bloom mentions it. So Bloom, it's a beautiful little takedown he has of her. He quotes Oscar Wilde. Okay, so this is right in the page 15, I think, where he makes the point, reading good books is bad for character, which is probably true. I thought that was interesting, that you might read Homer and develop bad character. But then he quotes Oscar Wilde. Oscar Wilde told us that all bad poetry is sincere. In other words, if you set out to write a poem that is going to have a message that's going to make the world better, that is going to be a crap poem.
Because for Bloom, it should be aesthetic.
Yeah.
It should be beauty. It should just be a flower and not be a ball bat.
Right. It's the difference between medicine and glory, I think. We've talked about that in another context. Do you do stuff because it's good for you, or do you do stuff because it's just good?
Right.
Or when I was a kid, we had after-school specials that you'd come home and watch, and they would be, telling you don't do drugs or...
Not good for you.
What they should have been telling you is the mysteries of compound interest or something like that, something useful. But you knew it was going to be a terrible... I used to watch Saved by the Bell. I'm sorry. I'll confess that.
Why?
And why? Because it was on...
I watched it for one reason.
Jesse Spano?
No, a young Miss Tiffany Amber Thiessen.
Oh, okay.
Don't dismiss me.
But there was the one where Jesse gets hooked on amphetamines. I'm not dismissing.
Oh, okay.
And it was the worst episode. In the middle of the episode, Zach Morris turns to the camera and says, "Don't do drugs." Ugh, it's horrible. But it was very sincere.
Right. It
was socially active and absolute garbage. And so after quoting Oscar Wilde that all bad poetry is sincere, he talks about, so President Clinton's inaugural poem by Maya Angelou was praised in New York Times editorial as a work of Whitmanian magnitude. And its sincerity is indeed overwhelming. Which I, as the kids say, I LOL'd.
Right. Well, before I even LOL'd about that, I LOL'd when he said, "Art is perfectly useless according to the sublime Oscar Wilde, who is right about everything."
Yeah.
Yeah. Bloom is super opinionated and really funny and really smart.
Yeah. Yeah. I've been poking into his Shakespeare chapter, and already some interesting stuff about the wife of Bath and Falstaff being almost the same person. That's pretty neat. So anyway, I went back and I read that poem, and he's right. It is so bad. It's so bad, but everybody praised it.
Well, she's the person for the time. It's about identity, and it's not about her art.
Yeah.
And he rails on that here. Oh, by the way, Maya Angelou, if you want to laugh your ass off about Maya Angelou, go see David Alan Grier. Go to YouTube and watch the comedian David Alan Grier do his Maya Angelou impersonation. He is a better Maya Angelou than she is. He'll do it on the Adam Carolla podcast from time to time, and he'll just do spoken word with that affectation. It's great.
You can watch the video of her delivering the poem. All the people are sitting there with a look on their face of, that you ought to look like you like something.
Right.
And then they all applaud madly this horrible poem because she's on their team and they're on her team, and it's a poem that advances a social agenda, and they're on board with it. It has nothing to do with the artistic quality of the poem, which is nearly zero. Yeah, it's so bad. I mean, if you want to fight me on that, anybody, it's a terrible poem.
But she is sincere.
Yeah. And maybe she's written good stuff, but yeah.
Well, I got to go back to David Alan Grier. The thing that makes his impersonation so spot on and actually so funny is that he is able to, just spout out this word salad, but convey the sincerity that she uses. And it's so incongruent when he does it, you'll just bust up. Like it's insane. But I think this is important in Bloom. He says right in the very first paragraph, the canon's true question is, what shall the individual who desires to read attempt to read this late in history? This question is actually at least 50% of what brought me to this canon. I used to have a goal of reading at least one book a week, and I would mow through stuff. And I read a bunch of good books, but I also read a bunch of entertaining books and maybe not great books. And as I started to get older, I thought, gosh, there's a lot of stuff I really need to read. And why in the world would I read James Patterson ahead of Descartes? I haven't even cracked Descartes. That would be crazy to do that. I don't have enough time. Mm-hmm. Bloom talks about that. He says, we don't have time. And at this point, the canon is arguably so large that no one can master it. So we need to be picky. And he also puts the question if not this, what? He says it has to be exclusive. The canon has to be exclusive. We don't have unlimited time. So if not this thing, if not Shakespeare, then what? If not this, then what?
Right. So on page 16, he says, the aesthetic is, in my view, an individual rather than a societal concern. So you've got limited time. Your goal in reading is not what will make your society better. Your goal is, I have 70 years, and I want to have as much, I think he says later, a hard pleasure as I can.
Yeah.
You forego the easy pleasure for the difficult, hard pleasure.
What a lovely line.
Well, I'm not quoting, I'm paraphrasing, but so we got to find it.
Then that's your line, even better.
What did I say? How good was it?
We want to seek as hard a pleasure as you can.
Yeah, that's a good line.
Man, you're pretty good. Well, our little slogan is the noble things are difficult at Online Great Books.
Mm-hmm.
Our friend Matt Reynolds at Barbell Logic is always yelling about how everyone should undertake and be refined by a voluntary hardship,
mm-hmm.
and how our barbell training is simple, hard, and effective.
Mm-hmm.
And these books are, I don't know if they're simple, but there's simplicity in reading from the canon. It narrows down what you should be doing, what is best for you, and it's darn sure hard.
Yeah, but the secret is, on the other end of voluntary hardship is more pleasure than you would get if you didn't do it.
Right. Because if the salt loses its savor, Karl,
it's no good but to be thrown out. Yeah. Page 17.
This is where I start to go off the rails with him.
On page 17?
Maybe, yeah.
Maybe. There's a couple things where he's a bit different than our focus, and I had to figure out how I was going to resolve that, and I suppose we can save that a little bit for the end. But
we don't have to resolve it.
No.
Can I state the main difference, I think?
Sure.
He reads the books for the aesthetic value,
mm-hmm.
and in reading, he is doing literary criticism. Everything
mm-hmm.
he does, I think, is in comparison to the other. And that's not why we do it. Is that the way you saw his view here?
Yeah. Everything is aesthetic for him, which is what you said. Like even the Bible, he's reading God as a literary character, and he doesn't think much of God as a literary character, but or rather he thinks he's like a Shakespeare villain, which is interesting, but he's not reading it as if it's a deposit of truth. The only truth, or the main truth for him, is how beautiful is it?
Right. Do you think that's a truth test for him? Falsehood is ugly?
I don't know. It might be. I'd have to read more of his stuff. Well, when he comments on Shakespeare, if we're going to get rid of Shakespeare because he's just speaking to Elizabethan England, mercantile concerns or whatever, he's a creature of his age, and we ought to read creatures of our age. The problem is, you just go read a sonnet and it'll blow your mind, and you say, I can't get rid of Shakespeare. I don't care if he's tied to his time. He's so good that he transcends his time, and he sucks me into him. He sucks me into his time. Mm-hmm. So are there qualitative differences between artistic works? That's the big question. If you're on the other side, at least the other side of Bloom, which thinks that art should subsume itself to the social good, then it's only just a matter of degree. You know, this guy's better at rearranging the words on the page than that guy, but they're all serving the revolution. My kids have gotten into composer Dmitri Shostakovich. They heard me listening to a little bit of it. I'm kind of grumpy about these things, and I think, you know, he's Stalin's court composer. You know, I'm grumbling about it. It's called socialist realism. The Soviet Union had an official art form, socialist realism, that it was all for the sake of pushing forward the revolution.
It is lovely, though. You know, like most movie score composers are stealing that guy.
Some of it's really good, but listen to the festive overture and see if you think it's actually festive.
If the party said it was. Back to Bloom.
Well, it's connected to Bloom.
It is.
The art should stand on its own.
And it has to be judged. Is this more than, less than, equal to? It has to be judged.
Yeah, and it doesn't. Well, it really doesn't matter what its connection to the time is. So, Beethoven number 3, Symphony number 3. Toscanini, apparently, when he was performing this, people would say, well, this is a fascist symphony because it was written originally for Napoleon. Although Beethoven got disenchanted with Napoleon, and then it's just Eroica, the heroic symphony. And Toscanini said something like, I can't do an Italian accent, but...
it started out sounding a little Russian. Is not
Napoleon, is not Mussolini, is Allegro con brio. That's a terrible accent. I'm sorry. I apologize.
I love it.
But the work stands on its own. And it will blow your mind. I've listened to that thing 5 times in the last week. It doesn't matter what he was thinking. It's so good, it doesn't matter what societal use it has. Does it make you any better of a person to listen to Symphony number 3?
Wait a minute. Are you saying intention doesn't matter? It's product?
Right. This is where we're running up against Hutchins and Adler, I think, who think that it's good for you to read this stuff.
Yeah.
That it does things good for you. So the way that I thought about this was Bloom is talking about imaginative works, about artistic works, and if they're not, he's treating them as such.
Yeah, I got that sense. He talks about it a little bit, but he doesn't just come out and say that. So I got that sense, and I went to the appendix and I scrolled down through there, and there's not a lot of hard philosophy. Yeah. He's got important pieces by Aristotle, but there should be more. Metaphysics isn't in there. I think it's just ethics and politics.
Yeah. So we don't read posterior analytics as a work of imagination or art. We read it because it teaches us how to think.
Right.
So there are books that have value that is not easily reduced to their aesthetic value. That's how I was taking what Bloom says, which I think is very well said and needs to be said, and what Hutchins and Adler are saying, that you need to be able to do this stuff to be a good citizen and to think well. I mean, I've got the Synopticon on my shelf, which is a collection of great ideas arranged topically, as if there is such a thing as great ideas, and it doesn't matter necessarily how well they're said.
Right.
So hopefully, I'm trying to resolve it. Bloom is making a good case for the aesthetic, but I don't think it's the whole case.
It's not the whole case. I think Adler and Hutchins and Bloom should have sat down at a table and found a way to say yes and hug it out. And I don't think that they disagree. These two schools here would not be at odds, I don't think. They're talking about two sides of the same coin. They both think that a canon has to be evaluated for its greatness, and that we can't read everything, and that we don't just let people in because they need a vote. They must be great, either through their idea or their aesthetic.
Mm-hmm. Did you ever read Woodhouse?
Yeah.
Jeeves and Wooster? And is it Aunt Agatha, the terrible aunt, who always wants him to read an improving book?
Right. An improving book.
Well, sometimes books aren't improving, or at least not. You don't read it and come out the other end as a better person. You read it and your mind is blown and your vision is expanded, I guess, but you're not necessarily better.
Is Aeschylus's Orestes an improving play?
If I get to the end of it and I'm on the side of the Furies, has it improved me? Because I am.
Yeah.
I think they rigged that trial.
If you read one of Shakespeare's sonnets, if you talk about the beauty of the thing, or the quality of construction, or the workmanship in the thing, whether that's Michelangelo's David, or one of these sonnets, or one of these works of high aesthetic value that Bloom loved, I think being around that sort of aesthetic beauty is improving. Because I know hanging out with ugliness, if all you read is Charles Bukowski, it's going to be tough.
Charles Bukowski, what did he write?
All those mid-century American dark memoirs and some fiction about his life as alcoholic running around with trollops and ne'er-do-wells and sloughing off work and living on the fringes of society.
So not an improving work?
I don't think so. He's a keen observer of, American culture and his times, and he's really he's very talented in describing all the disenfranchisement that he experienced and the futility of, some sorts of work. Like he was a mail sorter for the U.S. Postal Service for decades and just, probably a 150 IQ guy just throwing letters, and it broke him. And he wrote about it, and he wrote about it very interestingly, and he has something to say about it. But if that's all you read, it would, I think it would embitter a person. It is not uplifting.
Yep. Let's try to figure out why you ought to read this stuff. Then maybe we can go back and pick things out. So on page 37, which is towards the end of the elegy, he says, in any case, we cannot rid ourselves of Shakespeare or of the canon that he centers. Shakespeare, as we like to forget, largely invented us. Without Shakespeare, no recognizable cells in us, wherever we are. Without the canon, we cease to think. And then he says somewhere else that it's a matter of mortality, that it doesn't necessarily make you better. On page 29, Shakespeare will not make us better, he will not make us worse, but he may teach us how to overhear ourselves when we talk to ourselves. In other words, your inner life becomes bigger.
There page 37 you were talking about, I wrote down here, did Shakespeare expand cognition? There are things that I think serve as external aids to cognition that change the way our minds work. Like when you look at a city map of your hometown and see the lay of the land, it changes the way you navigate in the town, even when the map's not in front of you. Instead of getting from here to the grocery store being a trail that you follow, you can see, where you are in relative space to the thing, and you can get to the grocery store, even if you're off of your regular beaten path. Instead of your understanding of your city being a bunch of routes, you can see the whole thing. And it's because maps exist.
Right.
The abacus, supposedly there are people that know how to use the abacus so well or are so comfortable with it that they don't have to have one to do the operations. They can hold an abacus in their mind and see how they would move those beads around and do those complex floating point operations without having the tool in their hand. So when I read that about Shakespeare, I thought, does his portrayal of the conflict that is inside people and how they interact with each other, did his portrayal of that show us that we are individuals and awaken everybody to the idea that those interactions between the individuals were important?
Yeah.
Is that how he invented us?
I think so. So when I was reading this, I was thinking of Achilles. And I'm often thinking of Achilles. Achilles is really simple.
He's a very flat character. Very flat.
Well, I don't think he knows how to not be flat. He has this dilemma. Do I stay or do I go?
If I go, there will be trouble. If I stay, there will be double. That's what the Clash says.
That's right. He doesn't have the vocabulary to think all of this out. So when he's, in my opinion, I think he set up Patroclus to give himself an excuse.
Well, he damn sure didn't not set him up.
But I don't think he ever debated with himself, should I set him up? Because I don't think he thinks in those terms. I think he just did a thing, and he's a Bronze Age guy. He doesn't necessarily have the intellectual tools to think. So, and then you fast forward to somebody like Augustine, who writes the first autobiography where it's all about the self. And now you can talk about the self. And then you get Hamlet, to be or not to be, that is the question, whether 'tis nobler in the mind, etc. You have a development of our own conception of ourselves.
Well, let me ask the question, though. Do you actually mean Achilles, or do you mean Homer's portrayal of Achilles?
The only one I have is Homer's portrayal of Achilles.
Fair enough. But I wonder, according to what Bloom says, I think he pretty much says this, until Shakespeare pointed at those interactions. Maybe they didn't exist before. Maybe people's interactions were much flatter. Maybe they were very Achille-Patroclean. I don't know. Maybe people just acted and stuff happened. I mean,
yeah.
I don't know. I mean, did he add to the way the mind works?
Right.
Because experience of self is in the mind.
Yes. I don't think it's just Shakespeare, and I'm willing to concede that Shakespeare is a huge example of this.
Yeah, Augustine's part of that. Like you said, his meditation on stealing the apple or the pear.
Well, and Paul's letter to the Romans. The good that I want to do, I cannot do. The bad which I do not do, that's what I do. Whatever the actual phrase is. It's somewhere like chapter 7. That nobody in the Iliad calls Achilles bad or evil. They don't have a conception that there's a standard that a human ought to. I mean, there's honor, and I guess there's just honor, but there's no moral standard that he has to measure himself against.
Well, the standard is he heroic and glorious? That's the standard.
Yeah. Yeah, so he's not a very complex person. Nietzsche doesn't say it's Shakespeare. He says it's Christianity, and he's not a fan of Christianity, but it makes people interesting.
Okay.
Which they were not before. This is a genealogy of morals, that you sublimate your desires and turn them in on yourself, and you become twisted and complicated and interesting.
And neurotic and weird and myopic.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah, I have some Shakespeare in front of me. This is sonnet 73, I think. That time of year thou mayst in me behold, when yellow leaves or none or few do hang upon these boughs which shake against the cold, bare ruined choirs where late the sweet birds sang. It's an old man writing about, you can see that I'm old. And rather than just saying, I'm old, it's expanded. It's a season of a year. He's comparing himself to a tree, but it's a bare tree. But then he has this line that's about churches, bare ruined choirs. Where late the sweet bird sang. It's like, I used to be a church that was full, and now I'm not, And I don't know where, and there's a few more conceits in this sonnet, but all of that stuff now expands your conception of what it is to be old.
Damn it, Bloom. Okay, do we want to read the Angelou poem now?
No, oh gosh, no. Leave that as an exercise for the listener. That's your homework.
Here's one of my big questions for you against Contra Bloom. When we read at Online Great Books, I mean, people can read however they want. We don't tell them how to do. But by and large, are we engaged in criticism? Would you call our process critical?
No, I wouldn't.
I don't think so.
I would not. I don't think that we are judging Homer or Aristophanes or, this is, Victor Hugo says his history doesn't seek to judge, it seeks to understand. Yeah. I think that's our goal. If there's any criticism, it is of the self and the other selves who are reading it and coming together as a group.
I ultimately will criticize, but only because I very much try to do the how to read a book thing, where I come to terms with the author, I understand their arguments, I try to get to the point where I can restate all, steel man the author's stuff, and then I'll criticize. Is he right? Did he jump to a conclusion here that doesn't follow, or one of his suppositions wrong? Whatever. So at that point I will, but it's only after I've come to an understanding. Now, some of the aesthetic stuff, I can't help but criticize it. I don't like it. I just read a Comedy of Errors, and I don't like it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't like it. I don't know if it's like a stupid I Love Lucy episode. Everybody's just running around and nobody knows who anyone is. It's just dumb.
But there's that very funny part where the geography of Europe is compared to the woman.
Yeah. We're talking about, it's dirty.
It's very dirty.
Where is Naples? Well,
I might have been in high school when I read that, and I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe that I was understanding it correctly because it was so dirty.
Yeah, it can't.
Yeah,
a lot of Bush talk in there. There is some snappy dialogue that's reminiscent of like pre-Hays Code, like detective movies. You know, the quick talking dame and the detective. You know, you're just throwing these lines back and forth, and verbal sword fighting going on in there, which is interesting. So aesthetically, there are some interesting things about it, but I cared not for A Comedy of Errors. He says, Bloom, it all begins and ends with Shakespeare, really. There on page 37, he says, Shakespeare wrote, this is very Bloom, I think. Final answer. William Shakespeare wrote 38 plays. 24 of them are masterpieces. There it is. That's the answer. And he says, but social energy has never written a single scene.
Right. Socialist realism. The revolution doesn't make art. Shostakovich made art, and that was because of the genius that was him. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't Stalin doing it. It wasn't, forward the revolution.
Yeah, I think for Bloom, social energy, if there is such a thing, is the parade that gets behind the parade master, which might be Shakespeare, not the other way around.
The great writers, Bloom says there's an aristocracy in this,
yep,
which is probably why it just has to be contrary to social action, which attempts not to be aristocratic or says it's not aristocratic. Shakespeare popped out of nowhere. Charlie Parker went away to Kansas City to practice for a year and came back, and nobody knew where he got everything that he had. This is why Robert Johnson, they tell stories about deals with the devil, because they couldn't figure out how he got so good. Genius is an aristocracy. There are some people that can do it, and they can do it, and we can't. And all you can do is recognize them.
Yep, that's the definition of elitist. I mean, it's inaccessible to normal people.
Which is another thing, point where I thought there's a little friction with what we do, apparent friction with what we do, because we want, everybody who wants to come and sign up for our VIP waiting list and enroll. And we're not elitist. And we think everybody ought to read this stuff.
Yeah. But we're elitist in that we don't think everybody can write this stuff.
Exactly. Maybe you can.
I hope.
But you can sure read it. So Bloom's comments on education, a little further back in the book, that maybe you ought to focus on finding the few, which for me was just like Nietzsche's work on education. This is, I think, page 16 or so. We need to teach more selectively, searching for the few who have the capacity to become highly individual readers and writers.
The others who are amenable to a politicized curriculum can be abandoned to it.
Yeah. So if you're no good at writing, you can write the party papers, the dispatches from Central, whatever. But if you're an artist, you need some special care.
He talks about how reading is personal and individual. Duh. And he coins a little phrase earlier in this chapter about the school of resentment. And there's something about the fact that it's an individual, that it can only be an individual activity, that I think that the school of resentment doesn't like that. You got to read it the way they want you to read it. But reading for me is just about the only thing that you can only do for yourself. I can't read for you.
Right.
You can ask me to read something, but when I do it, it's still personal to me. All the reading takes place in my mind, quietly, and it may be one of the last private things that we can do. And I think this educational process, I'll be generous here, the modern educational process has trouble with that, because it's difficult to know what is actually taking place in the mind of the reader. It's hard to grade that, and it's hard to put that on a scale and move them to the next class. Like it's such an interesting, and so we have a lot of people that come to Online Great Books who weren't good students. I'm making the air quotes. They weren't good students. They weren't good readers, but that's nobody's goddamn business. And the truth of it is nobody really knows that, because they have to read the book for themselves, in themselves, for their own purpose. And the educational system, who is so bought into the school of resentment, doesn't know what to do with that. Some rowdy young man who wants to learn how to weld is going to get something entirely different from Huckleberry Finn than some young lady who prefers Dickinson. So how do you grade it? It's too individual, and the factory doesn't know how to deal with it.
Right. There's structural problems. If you have 30 age peers in a classroom, how do you teach them Shakespeare?
How do you teach Shakespeare?
I don't know. You read Shakespeare and you point to the shiny bits of it and you talk about it. But can you do that? Can you have a conversation? It's a conversational thing, but can you have a conversation of one person with 30? Socrates says learning is recollection. That's an individual thing. You recollect it in your own mind. You figure it out and it hits you over the head and changes your life. Maybe you learn how to love from standing there with Romeo and looking up at Juliet.
It's a beta.
Yeah, but he talked pretty. I'm going to learn how to be a cranky old man from Lear. I'm going to rage on the heath.
Yeah, would you like a little of the comedy of errors here?
Oh, I guess so. Sure.
Okay, I'm no Shakespearean actor. I'm not even an Oklahoman reader, hardly. He says, then she bears some breadth. And Dromio of Syracuse, because we've got two of those. He says, no longer from head to foot than from hip to hip. She's spherical like a globe. I could find out countries in her. In what part of her body stands Ireland? Antipholus of Syracuse says, Mary, sir, in her buttocks. I found it out by the bogs. Antipholus says, where's Scotland? I found it by the barrenness, hard in the palm of the hand. Where France? In her forehead, armed and reverted, making war against her hair. Where England?
Oh, my gosh.
Where England? I looked for the chalky cliffs, but I could find no whiteness in them. But I guess it stood in her chin by the salt room that ran between France and it. Where Spain? Faith, I saw it not, but I felt it hot in her breath. Where America? The Indies? Oh, sir, upon her nose, all o'er embellished with rubies, carbuncles, and sapphires, declining their rich aspect to the hot breath of Spain, who sent whole armadas of carracks to ballast at her nose. Where stood Belgium? The Netherlands? Oh, sir, I did not look so low. To conclude, this drudge or diviner laid claim to me, called me Dromio, swore I was assured to her, told me what privy marks I had about me, as the mark of my shoulder, the mole of my neck, the great wart on my left arm, that I, amazed, ran from her as a witch. Anyway, he goes on. It's just bog.
Yeah. The poor Irish.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah, and that was written about the time Jamestown was founded.
So he talks at the end about the dead white males and says, well, they might be white and they might be male, but they're more lively than you are. And that's the thing. It doesn't matter what Shakespeare is. You read the stuff, and it doesn't matter what his race is. It doesn't matter what his sex is. Who cares?
Would you know what it was if you didn't know what it was? If you'd never seen that weird woodcut engraving that we all see?
Yeah.
Would you know who he was? Would you know?
I don't.
Like he talks about, we don't know what his, we don't know what his politics are. We don't know what Shakespeare's politics were.
Right.
You never know that he had one kid. You don't know anything about him.
There's a whole literature trying to figure out who Shakespeare was. And Joseph Pierce thinks he's a crypto-Catholic. Other people think he's this or that. They don't think he's Shakespeare. They think Marlowe faked his death. And they always want to find some way to explain Shakespeare. Yeah, that you can't just have him be the middle-class guy who got himself some Latin and a little bit of Greek, read his Plutarch,
yep,
and was a genius, and made his craft in the theaters of London and became the greatest poet in the world. That is irreducible, unexplainable, aristocratic. It is so aristocratic.
Elitist.
Nobody... Yeah, it's like his line about who canonized Milton. Milton canonized Milton.
Dante explicitly canonized himself.
Yeah. Greatness is an aristocratic thing that if you're the sort that gets offended by such things, it's going to bother you.
Somebody has to be the best.
Mm-hmm. And it's probably not you.
It ain't me. But somebody's got to be the best, and to act like that's not true is it's just falsehood. And he says it's the last refuge of pure Platonism. Did you see that?
No, I didn't. Point that out to me.
I'm stretching a little bit. He says, our current new historicists, with their odd blend of Foucault and Marx, are only a very minor episode in the endless history of Platonism.
So Platonism is the enemy.
Maybe. It can be. Guns don't kill people. People do, Karl. Platonism doesn't kill people.
Was Plato a Platonist?
I don't think we know anything more about Plato's politics than we do Shakespeare's.
Right.
There are some people that are like, oh, Coriolanus is, you get his peek into Shakespeare's politics. Did Bloom say that?
Yeah, he says that.
Yeah, I've heard that, and but we don't know. We don't even know when we read the seventh letter, which Plato may or may not have read. You can go listen to that podcast that we did about Plato's seventh letter. Even though it's supposedly autobiographical and he uses I statements and tells his own story, we still don't know what his politics were. And we still don't know what his beliefs are. He talks about philosophy is important. He wants this ruler to have it. I went from here to there and all that. But he doesn't give us the contents of the philosophy. We still don't know.
Right. It doesn't matter. The work is what it is. And it's not that authors don't matter. Somebody wrote the thing and he came from somewhere. But the work transcends the author.
For sure. So we don't know anything much about what Plato thought. We don't really know much about what Shakespeare's views were and what he liked to do at 2 p.m. on a Wednesday. And we don't know anything about Homer.
Nope.
Nothing. I mean, nothing. Anything that people claim they know about Homer, I think, is just made up. I don't think we know anything about it.
Yeah.
I don't even think it's the same dude or chick or people that did the Iliad and the Odyssey. I don't think they're the same cat, but it doesn't matter. Do you think it's the same person, Karl?
I do, but...
How?
How do I think they're the same person?
Wait a minute. Why?
Because they're both really good. I feel like it's the same guy talking to me.
King Lear's really good too, but it ain't Homer.
Yeah, but it's the same guy that wrote Romeo and Juliet.
When I read the Iliad, it reads as, of course, I don't read it in the Greek, so I'm just running my lips here. It reads as so much more archaic than the Odyssey. There's almost no dialogue in it. There's no inner dialogue whatsoever. The characters aren't self-aware. But in the Odyssey, they are. Telemachus and Penelope and Odysseus are aware of themselves. There's some dialogue. It feels much more modern. It feels 400 years newer to me.
I shall have to think on this.
Stay tuned. Stay tuned, dear listener.
Well, so one of the things that Bloom says about art is that it's agonistic.
Strugglesome.
In other words, it's a fight. It's fightly. The poet is always thinking about the people that went before and trying to do better. What a problem we have in our literature that Homer's pretty much the first. Because how do you do better than he did?
It ain't easy.
Yeah, so it's so good at the beginning. It's hard to do better.
I love it that it's agonistic.
Agonistic.
My grandmother would have said strugglesome.
Did she actually use that word?
Strugglesome?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That sounds like a good word. That's going to embiggen our vocabulary.
Yes. Well, things are troublesome.
They are.
Wholesome. Fulsome.
I was hoping for fightly.
Fightly ain't bad.
I want to point to something on 28. He doesn't think that the West's greatest writer, he says, the West's greatest writers are subversive of all values, both ours and their own. Well, that's a disputable point. Do we read this stuff to make our moral values better? Sometimes. But his view of reading is at the end of this paragraph. Reading deeply in the canon will not make one a better or worse person, a more useful or harmful citizen. The mind's dialogue with itself is not primarily a social reality. All that the Western canon can bring one is the proper use of one's own solitude, that solitude whose final form is one's confrontation with one's own mortality. The Iliad might not make you any better. You might get it wrong. You might be like Alexander the Great and say, hey, I want to be like Achilles.
Yeah, and drag the city founders around the gates like Alexander did to relive Achilles' story.
Yeah. I mean, you might read Plato and think, you might read the Republic and think that you ought to be, a utopian. Mm-hmm. You ought to remake your society as a utopia.
Platonist.
Which I would consider makes you worse, personally. But I think you still ought to read the Republic because it's the proper use of your own solitude. It'll make you a better thinker. I don't even know better. It'll make your thinking bigger.
Embiggens.
Yeah, it's embiggening.
Yeah. Again, it's about the only activity that we can do only for our own sake and in complete solitude. And even if you're on the train surrounded by people and you're reading, it's just you. And I think there's something very, very good about it that lies in that. I need your help with something, Karl.
Yes.
Does he hate Walt Whitman or does he love him?
I don't think he hates Walt Whitman.
It's like he held him up so he could throw poop at him.
Where does he throw poop at him?
Oh,
I want to see this.
Well, let's see. Now you're going to make me dig it out. I have to support what I said.
He quotes the New York Times saying that Maya Angelou is Whitmanian, that she has Whitmanian magnitude.
Oh, my God.
I'm not sure I can help you.
You can't. That's all right. I'll find it here in a second. What's his elegy for Lincoln?
That poem is fantastic. Isn't that the Captain, my Captain?
Yeah, and he says that it's superior to lilies while in the courtyard bloomed.
I think that's praise of Whitman, actually.
Oh, well, I do too. And then he talks about how when people leave the road like Whitman did, that there's nothing there for them, and they can't produce art. They can't produce an aesthetic work. And it made me think that while he allows, insofar as he could, Whitman to do that and grants him that ground, he thinks that it's so free there that everybody's work after that is just, weird pretense and just a mess.
Well, I think that might be a great artist will show a new way of doing something. And then people will come in the wake of it and attempt to play in that field that's been carved out. I'm mixing metaphors. How do you carve out a field? I don't know.
Till it,
but you make,
plow it,
you do
survey, fence it.
Yeah. You lay out a new way of going and everybody copies you because they have to now. And how many of them can do the same job?
And his new way of going is no fences, no ditches, no road, no center line.
Yeah.
It's hard to follow him there.
Whitman can do poems that don't follow classical form because he's Walt Whitman.
Yeah.
And then you have all of 20th century poetry, or a lot of 20th century poetry, which has abandoned rhyme and meter. And everybody thinks that they're Walt Whitman, and not too many of them are.
Is Whitman going to make the cut? We have to choose. Is this better than, less than, or equal to?
What are the choices?
I don't know. Well, you have a canon. Just in your mind, is he equal to or better than what's already there?
Personally, I say no, but he's really good. But I could be wrong. Are you harumphing? You don't like my choice?
No, I don't know. I'm a big fan of Whitman, but I don't know.
I don't have his stuff running through my brain in the way that I have Shakespeare.
Right.
If you look at all of the coinages and ways of speaking that come from Shakespeare, you'll be amazed. You can't speak English if you excised all the Shakespeare out of it. It's impossible to do.
Yeah.
So no, he's no Shakespeare. Is he Whitman or E.E. Cummings?
Oh, no, well, Whitman.
Whitman or Dickinson?
Oh, Whitman.
Whitman or, who is it, Frost, the road.
Whitman's my favorite.
I think he holds up pretty well against those. Whitman or Sylvia Plath?
I'm telling you, Whitman's my favorite. It's going to be...
Whitman or Ogden Nash?
I love Ogden Nash. It's still Whitman. Yeah, okay. Yeah, he talks about, okay, here it is. It's on page 34 where he talks about Whitman's victory over Tennyson when lilacs last and dooryard bloomed. That's Whitman's poem about Lincoln's death versus Tennyson's poem Ode on the Death of the Duke of Wellington. And I've read them both, and I'm a bigger fan of Wellington than Lincoln, so that one's hard for me.
Well, but what about the poem?
Well, it's still hard for me.
You can't separate the poem from your thoughts on the people the poems serve
Yeah, it's hard for me. Yeah, the finest general that ever lived versus our Hobbesian 14th president. Was he number 14?
I can't remember.
Okay.
I don't have the count.
16th.
Yeah, I want to pull out a few more of Bloom's bombs that he throws. A couple of things that I really like. This is from the introduction, the preface and prelude. That there's a phrase that he does a couple of times that I really liked. The rabblement of lemmings.
Mm.
So this is page 4. It's talking about the school of resentment who wish to overthrow the canon in order to advance their supposed and non-existent programs for social change. I hope that the book does not turn out to be an elegy for the Western canon, that perhaps at some point there will be a reversal, and the rabblement of lemmings will cease to hurl themselves off the cliffs. Which is an interesting phrase. I think I'm going to work that into my own conversation.
Rabblement.
Rabblement of lemmings.
The rabblement of Reddit.
Yeah. If you don't believe that this is right, if you don't believe that there is aesthetic value, his suggestion to you, my suggestion was, Beethoven 3, but his suggestion is page 9. I feel quite alone these days in defending the autonomy of the aesthetic, but its best defense is the experience of reading King Lear and then seeing the play well performed. That's your experiment that you can do. If you think that all art's the same and it's just some kind of question of degree and not kind, go experience one of these high watermarks for yourself. Do kind of what Shakespeare's Hamlet would do. Think about yourself thinking about it.
Wow. Do you do DMT, bro?
No, I don't.
Oh.
I don't. Is that Joe Rogan stuff?
Yeah.
Yeah,
You
no.
think
I
about
don't.
yourself thinking about it.
We had a conversation in the gym last night. We've been chatting about this stuff about mind altering substances, and I'm against it.
I don't want my mind altered.
Exactly. I don't want my mind altered either. And the gentleman I was talking to is like, well, but what if the world's, I want to see the world. I think the world's beautiful and I want to see it as it is. And he said, well, what if it isn't? Well, then I still want to see it as it is.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't want to see it as it isn't.
Right. Yeah, I identify with my mind, whether I should or not. I don't want that thing, which seems to be me, changed.
Well, I want a real experience of it. I want an experience that is something that I've arrived at. I don't want to take some soma and feel better. I want to experience King Lear. I don't want to...
Why do you drink bourbon?
Because it tastes real good. I don't drink that much of it.
Okay, fair enough.
I measure it out by the gram.
Yeah, you count your macros.
Because macros, yeah. Yeah, no, I did say after I made that point, I said I was going to go home and have a martini. But I think that's the autonomy of the aesthetic. You just go see something that's really good. Are you familiar with two-set violin?
I am not. Is that a rapper?
No. Two-set violin is a couple of Australian violin players of Chinese origin who have a YouTube channel where they make fun of orchestral music and musicians and violins. And one of the so they'll watch the award shows, or they'll watch like violin players in movies, and like Cumberbatch hands doesn't even move when he's pretending to play the violin as Sherlock Holmes.
Right.
And it's funnier than you're going to think. They've got millions of subscribers, but they'll watch these award shows where somebody comes up on stage and does not very good artistic activity, sings a pop tune and throws in a couple of blue notes or something, and all of the judges, oh my gosh, amazing. But if they heard a Beethoven string quartet, they wouldn't get it. Jeremy Bentham, Pushpin equals poetry. That it's all the same, it doesn't matter, but it does matter. It really is better.
It is better, and he says that Bloom says that another one of the major yardsticks for canonicity, I don't know, is the rereadability.
Yeah.
So this Beethoven piece you're talking about, to get at the thing, you're going to have to listen to it many, many times. This pop music piece is going to repeat the chorus 4 times in 3 minutes and 40 seconds.
Yeah.
So it presents itself on a platter and makes it, it's the fast food of music. And I like some fast food, by the way. It's music in sound bites, and people can get at it in that little break on the award show.
It's not as good. It's not the hard pleasure. I want to find the quote where...
That's what I'm going to tell my wife.
The hard...
It's time. Honey, it's time.
So on page 29...
Is that what's going to have to be on our A7 squat shirts for Online Great Books?
The hard pleasure.
Yeah. What do you think?
That could be your lifter nickname.
If there was a professional wrestling style barbell lifting league.
What would my name be in that league?
No, yours is the hard pleasure.
Oh gosh. So the line that I have been misquoting the whole time here is, this is on page 29. The text is there to give not pleasure, but the high unpleasure or more difficult pleasure that a lesser text will not provide.
Yep. I love Peanuts comic strips. And Schultz does a whole lot with those 3 or 4 panels that he gets there. But he can't write the clouds. Aristophanes, the clouds in the 4 panels. So there's the hard pleasure.
Yeah, so you read the comic strip. My favorite of all time is Calvin and Hobbes.
Is that named after Calvin and my Hobbes?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it is. And he just quit. He just quit making them, and then he's gone.
Yeah.
He doesn't do much. He pops his head out every now and then. He wrote an introduction to the Charles Schultz complete collection. But Bill Watterson, he did a perfect work, and then he stopped and just lets it live on. And they're fantastic. They're wonderful. They're great in their art. He's the peak of his art. But it's pretty easy to read Calvin and Hobbes. And so you read it, and you figure it out, and you get pleasure from it, and maybe there's some layers to it, but you get some pleasure from it. It is not so easy to read Prometheus Bound.
No.
But at the end, it's probably better. The more difficult pleasure of Prometheus Bound is probably better than your favorite Calvin and Hobbes strip.
I just looked it up on Infogalactic, because I don't Wikipedia. And it says the pair is named after John Calvin, the 16th century French Reformation theologian, and Thomas Hobbes. There you go. For sure it is. Is this good aesthetics or not? Norman Rockwell. Go.
Yes. I say yes.
Is he high art?
Yes, I think so.
I think so too.
I'm a fan.
Yeah, I think so too. I don't think, without naming any specific Rockwell pieces, like you said in the Doyle episode about A Scandal in Bohemia, even though he was paid for that work, doesn't mean that it's any lesser. Even though he was commissioned to make Saturday Evening Post covers, I don't think those things are any lesser. Some of them look kind of like The Night Watch. Just a bunch of guys, headed to work or whatever. In Rembrandt's painting, he shows the essence of commonplace American scenes very wonderfully. He's got an eye for picking out the most important aesthetic pieces of those experiences and putting them right in front of the viewer so that they can't miss them.
Well, I think what he does, what Rockwell does, you look at the scene of the kids playing baseball, all these skinny boys playing baseball. It takes something that you might have done as a kid, and it elevates it.
Shakespeare.
Yeah. And you think, oh, all of this little small town stuff I did, look how beautiful it is. You can go to the work of art, and then you return to your life, and then you see, my life actually is something beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah, and yes, Rockwell.
Yeah, I think so too.
You're going to ask me about Jackson Pollock?
No, we already know the answer. Picasso.
No. Early period Picasso, maybe. Late stuff. Who looks at that for pleasure?
People that think they should.
I don't know. I don't think so. How about Monet?
Yep, it's lovely.
This is fun. We could keep going.
Yeah, well,
When are we going to do our art and poetry episode? Scott and Karl criticize the classics.
yeah, let's do that. Let's put together a little PDF of those things, and then we can send it out to our email list ahead of the show release, and then they can look at it.
But we're not professional art critics. How are we able to do this?
Because I'm opinionated, and I have a frame of reference in my mind against which I can judge these things, and I've developed a pidgin redneck vocabulary for expressing my ideas and thoughts about them, and then enjoy it for its own sake, because it is a hard pleasure.
Right.
The hard pleasure?
The hard pleasure. Rockwell didn't paint for the art critics?
No. He painted for himself, as my guess. I can't talk to him.
Uh-huh.
But don't you think?
I was listening to an art podcast once. I think I mentioned this before, but they were talking that you do not know, looking at a work of art anymore. You can't walk through a gallery and know if it's good. Nobody can do it. The only people, you have to call somebody. So if you want to buy art for your home and you want to buy art that you think is good, according to the modern art standard, it is impossible for you to walk through a gallery and pick it. What you have to do is call the art critic.
A tastemaker.
Yes, and you say, whom should I buy? And then you'll learn which little bits of, spots on the wall are the ones that you ought to pay money for. Mm-hmm. And I think that's crazy. You ought to be able to recognize the aesthetic grandeur of the thing you're looking at. You might not get all of it, but you should be able to get it. Somebody should be able to get it. Did you see the thing that Banksy did?
Which one?
There was a painting. Banksy is an unknown artist, and the painting was up for auction, and once the auction went through and the money was deposited, the painting ran itself through a shredder.
Yeah. It's brilliant.
That's high-level trolling.
Yeah, that's brilliant.
That's brilliant.
So here's some art that Hambrick owns. You can go look up Aussie, A-C-E-E, Blue Eagle. He was an American Indian from down around Muskogee, Oklahoma. He probably died in the 60s. And nobody told me it was any good. Mm-hmm. But you can go look this guy up and see some of the stuff that he did. And I didn't ask anybody, but I've bought quite a bit of that. And it suits me.
Yeah, no, you need to call the tastemaker.
Right.
The influencer. Influencer is exactly the opposite of a Bloomian aesthetic.
Yeah.
What's the point of the art critic? The point of the art critic, I would say, is to show you something that is beautiful. It's not to tell you what is beautiful.
Right.
It's to point, say, look over there. Isn't that neat? Oh, you don't think it's neat? Let me point out some things that are neat about it. But the object itself exists, and it has its value that you should be able at some point to appreciate.
Should be. Well, just go ahead. Just go ahead and appreciate it or not. That's your job. Well, we've gone on and on about Bloom. Bloom died. He'll be missed. He helped keep the lights on and was a warrior for the Canon. Don't you think?
Yeah, I think I'll probably read some more of his stuff. It's good fun.
It's wonderful. And he's bomb throwing. He's fired up and he's passionate. So he's one of the good ones. Thanks, Harold. You'll be missed.
Yep.
Well, there is another Online Great Books podcast. If you want to do this with us, or at least get some information about how you might read these great books and study them with your friends, you can go to onlinegreatbooks.com/podcast and join our little waiting list. And while you're waiting for the enrollment to open next time, you'll get some emails with white papers about our program, how you might do your own program, how to take notes when you're reading these important books, a summary of how to read a book, and a whole bunch of other goodies. Go check that out. Enrollment will be opening November 4th. I think this show will be coming out just before that. So if you're interested in enrolling, you can go to onlinegreatbooks.com/podcast. And just by going through that link, you will get 25% off your first 3 months of membership with us. And this time, We'll have a 6-month and a 12-month one, and you get a discount for doing either of those too. That'll be the first time we've had a long-term subscription available at a little discount for people.
It's a bargain.
What else, Karl?
Go look at beautiful stuff.
Aussie Blue Eagle. Go buy all that stuff. I'm a tastemaker, see? I'm a critic. I've already bought some. I bought it cheap before you knew. So now I want to tell you how awesome it is so you can buy it and drive the price up of mine. All right? All right. I think we've figured out how it works. Talk to you guys soon.